Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Lisa Duke, the program director at Bridges Center for Grieving Children. This afternoon, she will be talking about how children experience grief across development. This is the third part of a multiple part series that is through Kids Mental Health Pierce County in partnership with Bridges Center for Grieving Children. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Lisa.
Right. Thanks, Matt. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. Yeah, so this is the third, as Matt said, the second in the webinar series, as the first was a Lunch and Learn. So today we'll be talking about how children experience grief across development. Next slide. I am the program coordinator with Bridges Center for Grieving Children, a part of Mary Bridge Children's Hospital, and we are partnering with Kids Mental Health Pierce County to look at children and grief. And so today we will be looking at how children grieve as they develop. Our first webinar was on overview of children's grief. And as I said, we'll be looking at grief across development today. The next one we'll be looking at children's grief interventions, how to use them. And the fourth will be empowering adults in the support of grieving children. And our hope is to explore ways that children and adolescents experience loss and how we can talk with children about death in their experience. Go ahead. Next slide. So Bridges has been serving families for 35 years with our grief support groups. We have served over 10,000 individuals from over 5,700 families in those 35 years. And at any one time, Bridges may have approximately 95 families in the grief support program and approximately 20 families in our anticipatory loss program of support. Next slide. So why are we looking at the impact of grief on children? Grief can disrupt development in short and long-term difficulties, and that can show up academically, socially, emotionally. And so our hope is by furthering our understanding of how the impact on children, the grief on their development, we can look at ways, finding tools to support them in those areas of their development. Next slide. So in 2022, childhood bereavement estimation model out of Judy's house in the JAG Institute out of Judy's house in Colorado, they have for several years been giving an estimation of how many children 18 years of age and younger will experience the death of a parent or a sibling. And they break it out by states and then also look at it nationally. So in 2022, after the pandemic, the number for Washington children was 1 in 16 children potentially will experience the death of a parent or sibling before the age of 18. When I first started doing this work 12 years ago, it was 1 in 20 was the predominant belief of the number for children. In the nation, according to the CBAM model, it is nationally, it is 1 in 13 as of 2022. So if we look at the census for Washington State in 2023, the total number of residents in Washington State was 7,812,888 people. And according to the census, 21% of those over 7 million people are under the age of 18. So that gives us a number of 1,604,705 children and youth in Washington state in 2023. So if we look at the CBEM, the estimation for the number of children in Washington who potentially will experience the death of a parent or a sibling by the age of 18, that 1,604,000 over that number of children, it brings us to the potential for over 100,000 youth in Washington may experience the death of a parent or sibling by the age of 18. So 102,544 is the potential number. So, and the reason I put this up here is because it's staggering. I mean, it really is shocking to look at that number and give us a sense of why we're looking at this and why we focus on the impact of grief on children. We have a lot of children in Washington State who are impacted by grief, and so that's why we want to focus on how to support those children. Next slide. So children who are old enough to form attachments are old enough to grieve. For when I was doing this, working with children in New York City, many years ago, it really was, there was a question about children's experience of grief. And because it's different than adults, because their cognitive and language development is so different, of course, than adults, that there was often that question of how are they impacted? And the prevailing understanding now is that if they're old enough to form attachments, they are old enough to grieve. And many adults want adults in these children's life. They want a roadmap. It's a really common question and request when they first enter our program at Bridges. Can you give us a roadmap? Can you tell us the way through it? Can you give me a sense of how I will experience this and how my child will? And there, unfortunately, is no roadmap for the journey through grief. But what we know is that grieving children need to tell their story, retell their story. It helps to be in community, to know that they are not alone, and that is a significant impact on that child's life and their experience of grief. Next slide. So what we know about grief. Grief is isolating. Grief thoughts and feelings are often intense and unpredictable. They can come in waves and hit suddenly. Grief results in multiple secondary losses. A child may focus more on the secondary loss because it impacts their immediate life that day. Who will get them to school? Who will tuck them into bed at night? Some of those secondary losses. Grief experiences, like I said, may come in waves and last, of course, for years. And we know that children grieve in a family or family system, but we also know that grief is unique to the individual in their experience of grief. Next slide. So a fact sheet out of the Society of Pediatric Psychology in 2023, looking at children and adolescents, found that girls and adolescents are at greater risk for complicated grief and internalizing the symptoms of grief. Elementary school aged children and boys are at greater risk for social challenges. Black children are at greater likelihood to experience the death of a parent or sibling by the age of 20. Next slide. So death is more than the loss of the individual's physical presence. It's a loss of and change of oneself. It may include a real change in one's identity, a change in their sense of self-confidence. One's personality may change with the grief. And of course, a role in the family can impact their understanding of themselves and how they fit in this family. The loss and change of security may include a sense of emotional and physical unsafety. And change in financial security and lifestyle greatly impact the child. Loss and change of meaning, and the death can create a need to restructure and reevaluate the goals and how one finds meaning. Um, Re-examining of one's definition of what's meaningful in their spirituality, and the ability to regain a sense of joy can be impacted. Next slide. So factors impacting a child's adjustment after a death. The type of death may impact their adjustment. If a family member died from an illness, they may have had time to say goodbye, a time to have a little bit of a greater ability to accept that the death was imminent. If it was suicide and homicide, it may bring complications of feelings of shame and stigma. If there is challenges for the caregiver to accept the death and talk about the death as the adult, it can make it really difficult for children to find a way to express their grief. Demographic factors, the family may have to move, they may lose a sense of security financially, which can impact the child. Moving from one city, one known area to another can really impact a child socially and their adjustment. What kind of support services do they have? What was the quality of the relationship with the person before the death occurred? If it was conflictual, it can make it very difficult for the child to process their different feelings with the grief. And of course, how the family is functioning, how the family relates to each other, if it's open communication, acceptance of different ways of grief and expression of grief, can make it a lot more, make it smoother for a child going through that. And then pre-existing risk factors that can really complicate how the child experiences the grief. Next slide. So we know that children are changing as they develop. They are constantly developing, and they are changing cognitively, emotionally, socially, and spiritually. And children will grieve as they grow, and they will express that grief through behavior, emotions, physical reactions, and thoughts. Okay, we're going to dive into some different ages now. So, Matt, if you go to the next slide. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at some normal aspects of development at these different ages that we will talk about. And then we will talk a little bit deeper about how the grief might show up at these ages. So I would love, as we go through this, just throw some thoughts in the chat as we're moving through this. So 4 to 6 year olds, magical thinking. They're focused on play, pretty egocentric, a lot of imaginary thinking. The world revolves around them. Unusual associations and beginning to initiate at this age. My oldest at 5 years of age, we still like to talk about it. She's 26 now, but she had imaginary friends, Sashi and Sushi, and they were companions for her, and she would talk about them pretty regularly. And then she reached about the age of 7, and all of a sudden she announced that they had up and moved, they gotten married, and they'd moved to California. So they were gone. So, they were significant for her at that 5, 6 years of age. So as we think about this age, any thoughts on how grief might show up for 4 to 6 year olds? They tend to think what's mine is theirs, and maybe what someone else's is also theirs too. Behavior changes. Yeah, regression can be a part of that behavior change. So a child may revert back to wanting to sleep in bed with adults. They may have more baby talk. where they had more advanced language. Um, they may have such a difficulty putting words to their thoughts and feelings that they may act as if nothing happened. We often talk about kids at this age, yes, separation anxiety. So that difficulty doing some of the regular routines of life can be really difficult at this age after a death. Um, Afraid to separate from the adults or to leave home and do some of those activities. They may grieve in spurts. So they may be playing and actively playing and then all of a sudden feel sad and then be able to go back and play and laugh and be engaged in that. And so that can happen in spurts for them at this age. They have a difficult time with the abstract concept of an afterlife. So if the family has a belief in the person going to heaven and in an afterlife belief, the child may at this age may talk about wanting to die and go to heaven as well, because they don't have that understanding of that abstract difference. They may show, as Paula said, behavior changes. There may be more irritability, increased aggression across any developmental age, but definitely for this age. And that's really, we see in the younger kids, that increased aggression can really be related to the difficulty putting words to the thoughts and feelings. So acting on them can feel like a way to try and deal with what's overwhelming. Um, Children at this age may show a real concern of how and why the death happened. As they get closer to that 6 years of age, they may have real curiosity about the death and even be focused on it in a way that might be uncomfortable for older members of the family. More of a curiosity about death. Um, So repetitive questions can be challenging for older family members because children at this age are wanting to ask the same questions often over and over and over again. They do that normally anyway. I mean, why is a really big word for this age. And so with a death, that these children can really revisit the how and the why. Children at this age may believe that they caused the death, that they were unhappy or they did something that day that caused the death. And it's all trying to understand that how this could happen. They believe that death at this age, they believe that death is reversible, that somehow that person it may be coming back. And so what children need at this age is clear, honest answers with words that they use and understand. Very concrete thinkers in the sense of the words, they need the limited language to help them understand. Next slide, Matt. So 7 to 8 year olds, the age of curiosity. So at 7, it can be in normal development. It can be common that children in school may have greater anxiety because they're starting to look to the outer world, the bigger world outside of their nucleus family. And but they're still not logical thinkers. They're still egocentric. Language can be confusing at this age. They may have strange associations and difficulty seeing from another person's perspective. They still are very engaged in play, but they may have some more ability to have cooperative play at this age. So, any thoughts from the crew about how grief might show up for 7 and 8 year olds? Fears are really common at this age, and fear and fascination around the person's body who died and what will happen to the body. If there was a burial that the family had, it can be a fascination and a focus for children at this age about what's going to happen to that body. regression in learning at school for sure, and guilt was mentioned in the chat, and that's something that we'll dive in a little bit more, because guilt is a feeling that children across the ages can struggle with. Um, Fear of losing other family members, um, and they may have a hard time with sleeping, some of the somatic experiences of the difficulty going to sleep, stomach aches, headaches, um, those can really show up at this age. And more aggressive behavior, acting out, increased aggression at this age. There might be more school phobias, as mentioned before, that separation anxiety. Fear, yes, of that someone else may die as well. And that's common throughout the ages, but children at this age may put words to it more. And then the older age, where they may become more um, quiet about their questions or concerns. But at this age, and it can be really helpful for children at this age, in all ages, to create a plan, to create an understanding. We're not expecting that someone else will die, but let's create a plan of who will care for you, what will we do if that were to happen in the family. And that can really help a child feel safer and feel like, okay, the adults have some sense of how we'll respond to that. The children at 7 and 8 are closer, it's particularly with 8-year olds, they're closer to understanding that death is not reversible, that it's irreversible, but not really understanding that it's universal. Um, the children at this age are wanting to fit in. They can have some challenges socially and feel different than other kids if if their peers in their, maybe they're in a sporting activity or some kind of activity outside the home, and their peers have their dad with them, and their dad has, and this individual's dad has died, it can be really difficult to feel like they don't fit in, and they're different now, and so it can be very important for the adults in life to help them with that struggle with that. Very concrete in thinking, and often direct and very factual retelling of the death events can be common at this age. I've had many families talk about their child in this age range being at the grocery store and talking about the death that the family just experienced, where others older than this child are wanting to be more private, and so it can be challenging as the family, with the 7 or 8-year old who's just very direct with language. So next slide. Some of you are going to know this joke, I think, but the next slide. So this is just an example of how important play still is. So this was a joke that an 8-year-old um, said in group one night, and I bet some of you know the answer to this joke. So why doesn't the seagull fly over the bay? Because he would be a bagel. Exactly. So we see in our pediatric bereavement program that it's children at this age, 7 and 8, have often an amazing capacity for empathy and connection to their thoughts and feelings, but they also have a real need to play and play together, and of course have connections with each other. So humor is a very important part of their development. Next slide. So 9 to 10-year-olds, an age of learning, and the learning aspect of that is that they are beginning to have a sense of mastery, a sense of being able to accomplish some things with some tasks in their life. It may be with the arts, with a particular instrument. It may be in sports. Um, so that's a really important part of this age. More thought about the larger world, greater language capacity at this age, more ability to have a logical understanding. So For the most part, children in normal development by 9 have that cognitive ability to understand that a death is final, that it's not reversible. Um, there may be creative bursts at this age, and they're more able to follow rules and to have teamwork in some of their engagements. So 9 and 10-year-olds, their questions may cease at this age somewhat. They may turn more to their peers for answers. Um, they're trying on independence. They may have more reluctance to open up, and they may show increased anger at this age. Any thoughts of what might grief look like for 9 and 10-year-olds? And some of the responses, of course, are going to be acting out. Yep, like we talked about before, but definitely with greater cognitive ability and greater engagement with peers, there often is more acting out. Trying to please. Yeah, yeah. Feeling they really want to fit in. So pleasing others. And that internal blame. What is wrong with me that this has happened in our life? Yeah. What have I done wrong? And what that can really connect to in this age is that feeling of inadequacy and inferiority. So that's normal in this, as well as the greater sense of mastery, but it's normal to also have a sense of inferiority or questioning their confidence. And so a death happens for a 9 to 10-year-old, that's a greater impact on their self-confidence, their sense of who they are, not wanting to talk to others about what has happened. So more internal processing potentially for a 9 and 10-year-old. Um, yeah, and their aches and pains may appear more serious than the 7 and 8-year-olds or the 4 and 6-year-olds. The hope at this age is that they will be able to get back in all ages, but particularly at this age because they are developing more interest in the outer world. And the hope after a death is that they would be able to get back to some of those interests that they had before. Maybe it's with martial arts or with, again, an instrument or in the arts or in sports. And so that's the hope that they will eventually be able to get back to some sense of that routine or those interests. So on to the next stage. This is middle school. We all know a lot about this age and a lot of thoughts about this age. So it's an age of roller coaster feelings, friendship, maturity, immaturity. Friendships can change quickly at this age. They are really often developing individual talents. They may join a more premier team in the sport they're interested in. They may get more advanced in that musical instrument that they are studying. But they also are more private. Comparison is a huge aspect of this middle school age. They feel that all eyes are on them, and how are they measuring up, and how are they fitting in? 11 to 13-year-olds may really test authority, and as we've talked about before, that they may act out in that testing authority. Their body is changing, and as we know, one person's body may be changing a lot faster than another peer's body. And so, again, that comparison and trying to figure out, where do I belong? How do I fit in here? So, what do we think? What might be challenges for 11 to 13-year-olds with grief? There can be a real fear of others dying at this age in particular. They may withdraw from friends and interests, increased anger. They may test out how much they can share and who they can share. So a greater ability to understand rules, but not liking the rules. Yeah, testing that, taking more risks. Questioning where they fit in and bullying others, picking on others. And this can show up with how a child, 11 to 13-year-old, is identifying themselves, again, trying to fit in, and there can be some real bullying with that. And it speaks to a lot of fear at this age. They may be more likely to talk to someone outside the family. They experience emotional struggles between wanting to feel independent but still feeling very dependent. Then you add a death, and that can really impact that struggle to feel independent and feel safe to feel independent. They have a more complex understanding of death and loss, and their spiritual beliefs, their faith beliefs may become more important to them at this age, but it may also be something that they abandon because of the death. Blaming the other parent, and we have seen that and heard that quite a bit at Bridges. So trying to find a meaning of something that does not make sense, and so that blaming the other adult. Yeah. Next slide, Matt. And I would say at 11 to 13, that guilt feeling can really kick in as well. So before we launch into looking at the older teens, this is something that we do often at Bridges, and it can be really helpful to an activity that can help to get at some of the thoughts and feelings around grief. Because if we ask directly, what do you think? How do you feel? Of course, teens are often not going to come out directly and say, I feel comfortable saying a thought or a feeling. That can be really overwhelming to do that. So this is an activity that we've done many times, and it can help to get at and more of an abstract understanding of those thoughts and feelings. And also get done in a group. It can be helpful to see how different others can feel about their grief. So grief is what we think and feel on the inside. And if grief was a sound, a flavor, if grief was an animal, if grief was a color, if grief was a building or a song, what would it be? So next slide. I'll have you put in the chat. If grief was an animal, what animal would it be? Snake, giraffe, dragon, elephant. Yeah, I've heard bear, lion because it can roar. Um, so this black widow spider, dangerous. Yeah, poisonous. Scorpion, poisonous again. So it may be really powerful and big, like a dragon or an elephant, or it may be small but unpredictable, slithering in and out like a snake. Um, and so sharing this in a group can give a real sense of everyone's experiencing grief, but it can look different and it can show up differently. Be really loud, be really quiet, be really sneaky and unexpected, or huge and large, consuming all the space. So next slide. So teens, 14 to 18, the task of this age is to define who one is as a teenager. Next slide, Matt. So what we know about teens, that they tend to want to find some order in their world. Again, their self-image, who am I, is one of the major questions for them to face. Teens may appear more mature than they feel. Their physical development may be advancing faster than their emotional development. Again, where do I fit in? How do I make sense of the world? Seeking to separate and define who they are. A big task of the teen years, particularly as they get older, is to to look at what their future plans are. What might they look at next as they separate and move on? Um, and teens often, as we know, respond to stress with risky behavior. So, what might we be concerned about with teens? Yeah, risky behavior. And it's similar to the younger child who's having difficulty putting words to their experience, their thoughts and feelings with the grief, that may be acting out or aggressive with peers. With teens, it may be that acting out against themselves in risky behavior that's putting themselves in danger or putting others in danger. But it's a similar response to avoiding those thoughts and feelings that are overwhelming. Silence, isolation. That's one of the concerns for teens is that isolation that we look for. And suicidal thoughts can show up more, of course, with teens. They tend to think in ideals, and this does not fit in an ideal. And the intensity of feelings can be overwhelming, particularly for teens. They have the cognitive and more cognitive development and the language development. And so, with those feelings, they can connect more with those feelings. But the intensity is what can be really overwhelming for them, of course. And so, as professionals working with teens, one of the areas to focus on is to try and help them understand that that intensity won't last forever. The feeling may last. The feeling may come and go and change some, but the intensity will not last forever. And that can be important. So if they're trying to find order, a death, there's nothing about a death of a parent or a sibling as a teenager that makes sense. And they're trying to separate, and how difficult it can be to separate if there's been a death in the family. That appearing older than they are because of physical development can cause adults in their life to give them more responsibility. If they're an older um, person they have younger siblings, they may be asked to do more than they are really ready for in their development and what they feel that they can take on. They're seeking belonging, fairness, and justice. And a death can put a halt to that sense of the finding the ability to find fairness or justice in the world. So again, the isolation, that can be a primary concern with teens. And helping them to find community, find peers, to express what they're experiencing. And what teens need are adults who care about their experience, who can hear their feelings of possibly relief, and often guilt. It's a very common feeling at this age, and not try to fix it, but really hear those feelings and validate, normalize, acknowledge, and have some acceptance for that. Okay, next slide. So prolonged grief, it's not necessarily the predominant experience in a child's life that there will be prolonged grief or for the family. But it does happen. And prolonged grief is when the family or the individuals become stuck and potentially seriously impaired in their emotional, physical, social development and capacities. It may be for teens, difficulty looking at what's next. It may be for the adults, a feeling stuck in their occupational and their professional life. Next slide, Matt. So as Erwin Sandler out of Arizona State University, who studied pediatric bereavement, for multiple decades, has said that for most children, there is not the need for intensive therapy, that they will adjust, they will find their way through the grief. But that from his studies found that about approximately 20% may experience serious long-term problems that impact their development of depression, self-doubt, and as we mentioned earlier, the increase in suicidal thoughts and behaviors, self-harming behaviors. And so with that, I mean, the factors that can be associated with prolonged grief may be that there's psychiatric disorders in the child or the parents. There may have been maltreatment before the family member died, a greater number of stressful events that came with the death that impacts the child's sense or the teen's sense of stability, in that less supports around them. So what it may be that individual counseling and really a potential wraparound services for the family is warranted, and that's part of the professionals' distinction in working with the family, assessing and screening for that need. Okay, next slide. So some of the things that we have talked about have come up over and over across the developmental stages for children, and what are common: the somatic concerns, the physical manifestations of the grief, the intensity and duration of emotions is common across development. It may be, as we said, they may act out in aggressive behavior towards others, or it may be aggressive behavior towards themselves. Regression can show up at any developmental stage, and it will look different from a teen to a 4, 5, or 6-year-old, but it's still regression. So that aggressive behavior may be the way the child is responding to the overwhelming feelings, comparing to others, fear of losing others in their life, that isolation, shutting down from interests that before were an important part of a child's life, change of friends and change of support in their life. And then, of course, that self-blame can show up at any age across development. Next slide. So how do we talk to children about death? We listen to what they lead with, because that tells us at that moment what they are thinking and feeling. They may give us a clue into that. And so really trying to lean in to what they are leading with, the questions they're asking, what they're wondering about, acknowledging the intensity of feelings, that normalizing and validating is really important for children. Being open and honest about the death. We encourage in the pediatric bereavement world that you use clear words: death, died, dying. Euphemisms can really be scary for children. They are just across the board not helpful. And so, to say that someone was lost for a very young child, then they can be focused on, well, let's just go find them. Just like you do with your keys. You lose your keys, let's go find the person who has died. Connecting some of faith, or that God needed them, can be really confusing for a child. So we just really discourage anything beyond the clear, honest language around death. Again, talking about the guilt feelings is really important, because we don't want to tell a child to not feel anything. What they feel is what they feel, and we want that to be acknowledged and validated. And particularly with guilt, I think, because for adults, it can be really difficult to see a child feeling guilt for this death that happened, that we as adults know that they of course, did not cause it. But the important thing about with being adults with a child who might be experiencing guilt, is that one, we can't change that feeling. that we can't take a feeling away from a child. That doesn't work if we try. And two, it can give a message to the child that the adult is not safe for them to go to with whatever they feel, whatever they think, whatever they're wondering about. And the hope is that as this child grieves as they grow, that their need for trust is going to continue to be greater and greater. And they need to know that there are adults in their life, others in their life that they can trust. And so accepting feelings and wanting to know more about the feelings or the thoughts that they have can communicate that sense of trust that they can go to this person with what's coming up for them. So again, that normalizing the feelings and thoughts. Using the person's name and title can, again, communicate to the child that it's okay to talk about. We're not avoiding it here. And if they're using the person's name or they're using the title, their dad, then the adults around them can do that as well. And that again communicates to the child that it's safe, it's okay to talk about. It's not being avoided. Adults can fear if they bring up the person's name to a child that it may cause the child to feel sad. And we don't cause children to feel sad with grief. They're already feeling that. What we can do is hopefully create a place where they can know they're not alone and that they can talk about it and share those feelings. As professionals or adults in these children's lives, it's okay to not know an answer. And maybe it's then saying, but let's try and figure out who might have an answer for that or where we might be able to get that answer. Next slide. So talking about suicide, I have a separate slide for this because it comes up very often. And we in the pediatric bereavement world, again, really encourage sharing the cause of death, including suicide and homicide, and maybe in particular, but including. And children know more than the adults want to believe that they know. They really do. In this day and age of social media in particular, children know. And they don't necessarily know the details, though. And a child who's not given the details, particularly a young child, again, as was talked about in multiple responses in the chat, that child can find a way that they are at blame for that reality of the death. And so not sharing the reality does not spare the child the pain. Not sharing the reality does not spare the child trying to make sense and often finding ways that they're at fault to just try and find a way to make sense of what does not make sense in their life. It may be that the child is too young for the details of the death. Again, we talked about sharing in their language and what they can understand and what they could tolerate. But we do encourage that a child is told that the person ended their life, that they chose to do that, if it were suicide. And how many professionals in the pediatric bereavement world talk about sharing this is that to talk about that people have illnesses and some people die from illnesses and people see doctors and people try to get help for those illnesses and sometimes people die from that. And the family member who died from suicide had an illness in their brain and they may have tried to get help for that and that help didn't work. And so to relieve them of the pain of that illness, they ended their life. Um, Never an easy conversation, but really crucial for that child to be able to have adults who are willing to have that conversation with them. Next slide. So, fundamentals of what children and teens need. They need structure, consistency, some predictability, non-punitive boundaries, and nurturance. And the goal with children and teens who've experienced this sudden disruption in their life with the death of a family member, the hope is that they will get back to some routine of life. So some consistency of school, some predictability of their day and getting back to daily tasks of life. And then that's, the structure as well. It may be that they need a time where they don't go to school for a period of time with the expectation that they will get back to that. It may be that the family creates a plan of what they'll do if they're in school and they need a break and they need to step away, whether it's in that classroom or with the school professionals of the counselor, that they're the social worker that can provide a space for that child to step away with the expectation that they will go back to the classroom and to the routine of the day, and with the expectation that they will eventually be able to get back to a full day. But different children are different, and some may pour themselves into school and the tasks of the day, and others, as we've talked about, may really need to take a slower pace with anxiety or the separation and fears that are coming up for them. What all children need are they need adults in their life that are interested in their unique experience. Children need to be seen, be heard in their story of the grief, and acknowledged in their thoughts and fears and feelings around it. Next slide. So children need to tell, retell, and tell again their story with the grief in their life. Next slide. So Bridges Center for Grieving Children, this is how we can be reached, by this phone number, email sent to the staff with any questions or wondering about the process or a program or a fit for a family. That's encouraged. Family members are encouraged to call us, even if they're not ready for our grief support program. The staff is here to work with the family on questions and concerns they have around what their children are experiencing, how to talk with their children about the death, how to work with the school professionals, how to advocate for other needs, what might be behaviors or concerns that are associated with the grief, and what might be have already been a part of their challenges for that child before the death ever happened. So kind of helping them to sift through some of those questions as they are starting on this journey. So that's how we can be reached. Next slide. So this is some of the references from the content in the webinar today. And next slide, Matt. Yeah, so open for questions. There is another slide that for some reason is not showing up, but I can get it to folks, and that is looking at some of the national resources. So there is Bridges can be found at marybridge.org/bridges, and that's our website. We have some articles there, and some video and some question and answer page on our website. Aluna Network is another option that they do the Camp Aaron's and the Mariposa camps for families impacted by substance use disorders. Um, they have a vast resources on their website as well of ways to support children who are grieving. There is children's students, grieving students .org, and that is a website to help in the schools and with students who are grieving. There is the National Association of Children's Grief, and on that website they have a map of the nation, and one can look across in cities and states across the nation to see where there are pediatric bereavement support in that state and city in that region, which can be really helpful. Of course, Pierce County Mental Health has many webinars to support children in all challenges around mental health concerns. Um, any questions or additional thoughts about children and grief and And any concerns? I really appreciate you joining this webinar today and jumping in and with all of your experience and excellent um, comments in the chat to support this webinar today.
Okay. Uh, just wanted to say thank you to Lisa for sharing some very important information on how to support the kids in our lives and the kids in our community. And wanted to say thank you to all of you participants for taking the time out of your schedule to join us here this afternoon. And I will stop the recording